This is a short story by Cousin Kate, Catherine Douglas Bell. She lived 1818 to 1861. Most of her books are books for young readers. I think it can be read by young and old alike, though. This one is called The Child's Offering. Louis, I think you did not attend much to the reading of the chapter this morning, Mrs. Graham said to her little boy one day after breakfast. Not to all, I dare say, Mama, he admitted. And why not to all, my boy? Why, you see, Mama, it was a pretty long chapter for a boy like me to listen to all through, and then, he hesitated. And then, she repeated gravely, waiting for an answer. And then, it was not quite about things for me, you know, he said with a little hesitation. It was all about the sacrifices and burnt offerings that the Israelites had to give. We have nothing to do with offering up bullocks and sheep upon God's altar. And have we no offerings to make to God, my boy? Mrs. Graham asked seriously. Have we any, Mama? He said, surprised. I didn't know that we had. I don't know what they are. Do you remember where Peter speaks of our offering up spiritual sacrifices acceptable to God through Jesus Christ? Answered his mother. Yes, I recollect now, he cried. Papa explained that to me. He told me that we had offerings of praise to give to God. And I remember, too, last summer, when Caroline had been so very ill and was getting better, a gentleman came to ask Papa for a subscription for a missionary in some bad part of the town, and Papa gave him a good deal. And when the gentleman said it was more than he had expected, Papa said that he was so glad to give a thank offering to the Lord for his goodness in making Carrie well. That was like the thank offering of the Israelites, Mama, was it not? His mama assented, and the little boy went on eagerly. And I remember that when Caroline could not go to the boating party because it was her hour to read to blind Sally, and Cousin Annie laughed at her for giving up so much pleasure for such a reason, Caroline said, Shall I offer to the Lord of that which costeth me nothing? Her reading to blind Sally was her offering, was it not, Mama? A very small offering indeed, Caroline said, blushing to hear her kind deeds spoken of. But, Mama, pursued Louis, all that is very well for Papa and an old girl like Caroline. But what can a little boy like me offer to the Lord? I have no money, and there is little work that I can do for God. Don't you remember that we are told that to obey is better than sacrifice? Cannot you, little boy, as you are, make to God an offering of obedience to his commands? To be sure, and so I can, he cried eagerly, and I should like to do it. And had you listened to the chapter read this morning, you would have heard how jealous God is of any blemish or defect being found in the offerings made to him. The Israelites were to give to the Lord the best of their flocks and herds. Must not we give him our best obedience? Must not we be careful that there be no defect, no blemish, or stain in what we do for his sake? Indeed, yes, Mama, he cried. I should like my obedience to be without blemish. I suppose we should all like that, Caroline observed quietly, if only it could be without too much trouble to ourselves. Mrs. Graham was called away, and Louis began to gather together his school books and to pack them into his satchel. Caroline went on with a letter which she was copying for her father. After a minute or two, Mrs. Graham looked into the room again. Louis, she said, poor Willie has lost his slate. Will you help him look for it? He is such a bad seeker. He never can find anything for himself. "Oh, bother," cried Lewis impatiently. "I can't waste my time seeking for all the things he chooses to lose. He is the most careless monkey in the world. I wish you would help him," his mamma persisted. I cannot just now, nor can Caroline. She must finish Papa's letter." "Let him help himself then," Lewis said very crossly. "I am in a great hurry. I must see Charlie Bell before school about our cricket match." Mrs. Graham had been obliged to go away while he was speaking, and could not again ask him to help Willie. And having packed up all his books, Lewis was running out of the room when Caroline caught him by the jacket as he passed her. "Dear Lewis," she said persuasively, "don't you recollect God has said, 'Do unto others as ye would that they should do unto you'?" "Well, that's all very well," he answered impatiently, "but one can't be always doing that, you know." And he freed himself hastily from her gentle grasp. He could not, however, get away from her words. They kept in his mind and would not leave him at peace. He walked quickly to the front door, but stood with his hand on the lock. He could not get quit of the feeling that God was now demanding from him an offering of obedience to his command. He was afraid to refuse it. He turned from the door. "I suppose I must," he muttered, and then in a loud, cross tone called to Willie, who was coming downstairs. "Where had you the slate last, you little fool? I never saw such a plague as you are." Willie, very humble and sorry to give trouble, tried to recollect in which room he had been doing his sums on the previous evening. But before he could make much out of his confused recollections, Lewis had found the missing slate in the hall under a heap of cloaks. "There it is for you, you careless monkey," he cried, flinging it at Willie, without much care for the safety of either the slate or the child's head. "Take better care another time." And throwing open the house door, he ran down the steps and off to school. He fancied that he ought to feel well content with himself for having made an offering of obedience to God, but he could not. And as the words "without blemish and without spot" came to his mind, he felt sadly about his grudging spirit, that his grudging spirit had cast an ugly blemish upon his trifling act of obedience. "I wish that there was something else for me to do," he thought. "I wish I could find another offering to make to God. I would take care that it should be without blemish. But I have only to go to the class for a long time, for more than 5 hours. I shall have no offering to make." Then it occurred to him that God had commanded him to be diligent in business, and he comforted himself with resolving to make an offering of obedience to God in this thing, and to take care that it should be a very perfect one. Very diligent and attentive he was through all school hours, and as he was strapping up his boots to leave school, he smiled to himself and thought, "Yes, I think I did that very well indeed. Surely that was an offering of obedience without blemish." But he checked himself and suddenly, even while the words were in his mouth, for he could not help recollecting that a good deal of the credit of his attention and diligence must be given to his wish to get above Charlie Bell, between whom and Lewis there was a great rivalry, both in lessons and games. To get above Charlie had been a stronger motive than to obey God. And here Lewis saw that a blemish had been cast upon his offering of obedience. He had no long time to think over the matter. His name was loudly called by the other boys from the playground. The cricket match had to be arranged, and Lewis hastened out to help in the consultation. All was settled, the honorable post of bowler given to him to his intense delight, and the game was going to begin, when a message was brought him that his mother desired he should come home at once instead of remaining for an hour, as he was generally allowed to do. It was certainly a trial to the little fellow, and he did not bear it well. He grumbled and growled, and complained loudly of the hardship of being forced to leave his game, accused his mother of unkindness in sending such an order, and should most certainly have disobeyed it if he had dared. He went home as slowly as he could, rather hoping that his delay might cause his mother some inconvenience. And when he made his appearance before her, he looked as cross and sullen as a boy could look. His conscience smote him when he found that he had been sent for because his father had proposed to take all the children to see a panorama which Lewis had been more anxious to see, and which Mr. Graham had found out was to be exhibited for only that one day more. Lewis felt that he had not deserved to have his wishes so recollected and cared for, and he wished that he had come home in a more pleasant and dutiful spirit. He tried to drown self-reproach in the pleasing thought that he had at least been able to make another offering of obedience to the Lord. But this delusion could not last above a minute or two. He could not help knowing that he would not have obeyed had he not been afraid to do otherwise, and that, at any rate, his growling and grumbling must have cast a black stain upon an obedience, however little forced. He felt disappointed with himself and humbled. I don't understand, he thought. I fancied that it would be so pleasant to take pains to keep my offerings to the Lord free from all blemish and stain, and now I find I cannot. I think it must be because all these things have been mere everyday work. If I had any work really to do for God, I am sure I should find it easy to make it perfect. And he set himself earnestly to seek for such work. It was not long before he found it. At dinner, Mr. Graham mentioned that an old man whom they all knew well was very ill, dying, the doctor feared. He had always been a careless, godless man, and Mrs. Graham asked anxiously if he had anyone with him who was likely to lead him to think seriously of his state before God. I saw him this afternoon, Mr. Graham said, and when I spoke about these things, he listened more patiently than I could have expected. I wish I could see him again tonight, but I cannot, and I have no one to send. You must not go out with that cough, and Caroline is away. It is a great pity. If there were only someone to read a chapter in the Bible to him, it might do him good. Couldn't I do that, Papa? Lewis asked. Mightn't I go, Mama? His mother gladly consented, and Lewis was greatly pleased. Here was an offering to make to God of the very kind he had longed for, and he set himself earnestly to make it as perfect as he could. He was very diligent and attentive in learning his lessons, that he might have more time to give to the old man. He consulted anxiously with his mother as to what chapter it was best to read, and he took great pains to read distinctly and in a pleasant voice, so as to catch the old man's attention and interest. He thought that he did very well. He believed that now, at least, he had made an offering to the Lord without blemish. And again, well pleased with himself, he was willing to tell his mamma how sorely he had failed in his efforts. I did not know that it would be so difficult to keep the offerings without blemish, he said, and I was much disappointed. I had almost lost heart and resolved to give up trying when this thing came to be done, but in it I really succeeded. Don't you think so, Mama? Mrs. Graham hesitated. Don't you think so, Mama? He asked again more eagerly. Oh, Mama, do you see any blemish even in that? I don't, Lewis dear, she said tenderly. I should like to think that all was right. I should not like to judge you hardly. But from your tone of triumph in telling your story, I cannot help feeling a little afraid that you may have thought too much of pleasing yourself and not enough of pleasing the Lord. I don't understand you, he said, a little pettedly. I am sure it was not to please myself that I gave up my new book and went out to read to James. Was it not to enable you again to think well of yourself? His mamma asked gently. You remember, do you not, that you used to say that, while Cousin Annie helped others for the sake of showing how good she was, our Caroline helped them only because she loved them and wished to make them happy? Yes, Mamma, he said in a low tone. He began to understand what she meant. And might it not be so with you tonight, my dear boy? When you went to read to James, did you feel simply desirous to serve God and to help the poor old man, to know that what God required of him? Was there not mixed up with that a desire, a pretty strong wish to show yourself how good you were and how well able to offer a perfect offering to the Lord? Louis bowed down his head without answering, but the bright scarlet in his cheeks and the saddened, humbled look in his eyes answered for him. There had been a dark blemish of self-seeking, self-glorying in his work for God. After a minute, he looked up again and said sorrowfully, "Mama, it doesn't seem to have done me a bit of good to learn that God desires our offerings to him to be without blemish. I seem only to have done worse than ever before." His mother smiled. "You remind me of yourself when you were a very little boy, Louis," she said. "You were one day very busy turning over some old dusty pieces of wood in the dark closet at the end of the passage. And when you came in here into the bright sunlight, you cried out, 'Bad sunshine, make my hands dirty.'" Louis smiled at his own folly, but did not seem quite to understand the application of the story. His mama explained, "You have today, for the first time, brought your poor imperfect obedience into the light of God's perfect law," she said. "And when you see how far short it falls of what God requires, you are inclined to think that it is your knowledge of God's wishes that has made it so bad. You do not see that it has all along been as defective, only you did not know it. I'm going to read that again. You do not see that it has all along been as defective, only you did not know it." Louis looked thoughtful and did not speak for many minutes. Then, laying his head on his mother's shoulder, he said softly, "It was very sore to learn it, Mama. It made me unhappy. But now I think I can be a little glad. It is better to know how far wrong we are, even though it does make us uncomfortable and unhappy." "Yes, better, far better," she said, kissing him tenderly, "because when we see how unable we are to do the thing rightly, then we are driven to go to God to seek strength to make us able. And you know, Louis dear, he has said, 'He that seeketh shall find.' Yes, Mama, and I think I shall now seek for more than I have ever done before." And that's the end of that short story. Till the next time, may God bless.